Howdy folks, this is CowTipper Vern again. I'm kind of excited to do this topic today. When I first conceived of making a podcast, I had a bunch of topics in mind, and this was my favorite of the topics. I was really excited to do it. Today's topic is going to be things I learned about the 2x2s since leaving the 2x2s. Several months ago, a professing person asked me why I thought I knew so much about the 2x2s and the goings-on in there. And they asked me point blank if I thought I knew more than them, and if so, how could I think so, because I'm not part of them. How would I know so much? How could I know more than somebody who is inside? I didn't actually answer, because I didn't have a good answer. I had a bunch of answers bouncing around in my head, and I didn't know how many of them would be nice to say. But I'll answer that now. There's a couple answers. One, it would be very weird if I said yes. It'd be very strange if somebody on the outside knew more about the inner workings of a group than the people on the inside. So I hope not. But at the same time, I've learned a lot since I left, and the things I've learned are a bit troubling, I have to say. If I'd have known the things while I was in that I know now, I wouldn't have lasted inside. I would have left immediately. Any of the things I talk about today are things that would have definitely led to my exit. So it's a little strange to know them now, and to think that people on the inside might not know about them. That it's just not part of the culture to know stuff like this. Being an ex and also being an admin of an ex group make me sort of a strange safe space for people. Even before I started the group, as soon as I left meetings, people on the inside started confiding things in me, which I thought was really strange at the time. And the longer I am away, the more I realize that people just need to vent some of this stuff. They don't feel safe venting it inside, so they vent it outside. You'd think that would bother them more, but they need someone to talk to. Then, of course, once I started the group and we became kind of a clearinghouse for news for a little while, especially right after Brewergate, people started just bringing us stuff. Even people on the inside would start bringing us gossip and all kinds of stuff. And so today I'm going to talk about a bunch of things that I learned after leaving. These are all things that I didn't know about the 2x2s while I was in, but have learned in the past few years since leaving. I'm going to give a little disclaimer, a bit of throat clearing here at the beginning of this all, that almost everything I say here is probably better classified as rumors. People just tell me stuff, and that's it. I can't independently validate a lot of what I'm going to say here today. So I'm not making any claims about my old faith. I'm not making any claims about people in particular. I'm not going to actually talk about any specific people. But I also feel pretty confident about these things for one main reason, and that's because everything I talk about today, with exceptions that'll be pretty clear, are things that I heard many, many times. There's a couple stories I'm going to tell that are unique stories, but everything else I talk about today is going to be based on things that I've heard several times over from sources that didn't know each other, or sources that didn't know they were saying these things to me. These aren't just one-off anecdotes. These aren't just one-off rumors, random things I heard one person say one time and I blew it up into a story. This is going to be a set of things that I heard so many times that I realized it was a trend, and I realized there had to be some truth to it, at least by my estimation. This is all my own judgment. I'll also warn you that if you're professing and you don't like to hear nasty rumors about yourself, I'll just remind you that you clicked on this video yourself and you chose to listen to it. You don't have to listen to it. If you don't want to hear rumors that you don't like, you can go watch something else or get off YouTube. Don't get online. Do what several overseers have said and just don't get online. Don't look for this stuff. The first topic I've learned a lot about since leaving is the workers themselves. I've learned a lot because I've talked to a lot of ex-workers, and there's certain things they say that are almost universal, and I'll talk mostly about those. There's a couple interesting little side notes that I'll include too, but most of this seems pretty much universal. The thing that surprised me the most about workers, as I've gotten to know ex-workers, is how their beliefs don't really align with each other. There's a very simplified, very vanilla theology to the 2x2s based on a very simple reading, straightforward reading of the Bible. I'm not making fun of it. I mean, every Christian group reads the Bible a little bit differently. When you listen to a gospel meeting, especially, you typically won't hear a whole story in the Bible. You won't hear a whole chapter. You'll hear a verse here, a verse there, Kind of a rock skipping across a pond approach is how one ex-worker referred to it. But the messages tend to be pretty vague, and if anything, they prop up the ministry structure itself, and that's about it. There's not a lot more to it. I wouldn't even call it a theology because it's not really developed in any way. And again, that's just my judgment of it, and I don't judge anybody for it. It's just, I'm just noting it. What's fascinating to me is how many workers, when you talk to them individually, have very different takes on things that they wouldn't say from the platform. They're not united really in any way. I've talked to a handful of workers who, even while they were in, were fairly agnostic. I don't really know what to do with that, but it's interesting. It's interesting that the one true way has a lot of ministers who don't believe it's the one true way. Even the ones who believe wholeheartedly don't necessarily believe in the exclusivity that acts as the foundation for the entire group. In fact, a lot of them don't even believe in the Christian exclusivity of it. Their values tend to change person to person. If you grab one random worker and ask them a question and then grab another one, you'll get completely different answers. And that's normal. I mean, they're people. We're all people. But we take what they say as doctrine. A lot of times we're taught growing up in meetings, we're taught that what the workers say is essentially the law. They speak for God, essentially. Whether we say it that openly or not, that is how we treat them. So when I find out later that a lot of workers aren't even clear on their own beliefs, because of maybe being disenchanted with their place in the ministry, confused about their own doctrine, confused about their own theology, confused about the teachings, and maybe annoyed at things within the ministry, annoyed with whatever. It's fascinating. I don't know what to make of it, really. I've also heard a lot of people get different advice that's really fascinating, too. Depending on where you are in the world, there's very hard and fast rules, like the West Coast of the United States having a no divorce and remarriage rule. No on divorce, absolutely no on remarriage. But if you talk to the workers individually, you'll get different advice. I've heard of people who've been advised to either stay in marriages that are abusive or leave them. Unwanted pregnancies. I grew up thinking that no worker would ever say that abortion is good, for example. And yet since I've left, several people have told me that workers have advised them quietly to get abortions when they had unwanted pregnancies or teen pregnancies or something like that. There's a whole follow-on topic to the unwanted pregnancy thing, which is the Baldwin babies, and I've learned a lot about that, and I'm not going to talk about it. It's too fraught. It's too crazy. Write this term down, though. Write down the term Baldwin baby. It will be a topic in the future. I don't know in what sense, but it's a pretty wild topic. Someday maybe I'll talk about it, not right now. It doesn't feel safe to talk about right now. There's some very weird, sketchy, I would say, morally ambiguous, at best, adoptions that have taken place, where workers have placed babies in homes, taken them from one home and placed them in another home. And that's as far as I'm going to go with that. I don't feel comfortable with that topic at all, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I want to acknowledge it because you're going to hear more about it. People will start making a fuss about it at some point. But workers have all kinds of different ideas about theology. I've talked to several workers who would read other versions of the Bible besides the King James Version while they were workers. Most of them knew not to speak from it because they would get shouted down by somebody, no doubt, probably get scolded by an older worker. Some of them did speak from it. I've actually been in fields where that happened, where younger workers spoke from non-King James versions of the Bible. And the different versions of the Bible are quite a bit different. If you read different Bibles, you'll realize that words are changed a lot and meanings are changed a lot, and the King James Version isn't even really the original in a lot of cases. But it's the only one that the older workers like. In fact, we had a worker in our house tell us one time that it is the most accurate, so we had to read that one, which, we even knew at the time wasn't true, but that's how this worker felt. And younger workers have different feelings about that. I always thought that was interesting. Back to the exclusivity. Exclusivity is preached from the platform constantly. I've called into many meetings. I've called into especially convention seasons since I've left. The "We Are the Only Way" sermon gets preached every single day of every convention. It's constant. The crazy thing is, a lot of the workers don't believe that. I don't know what to do with that either. It's very strange to know that workers don't believe that, but still some other workers preach it. There's a divide there that's really interesting to me. I think over time, maybe we aren't the only way. The non-exclusive ones might be leaving, but for now, even if you ask them, not all of them believe that. I even heard about one overseer that this worker who knew that overseer, or this ex-worker who knew that overseer, said pretty confidently that this overseer didn't believe in the exclusivity. Now, since then, I've heard this overseer preach, and it seemed pretty exclusive, so I don't know. I'll talk about the history more some other time, but another thing I find fascinating about the workers and their beliefs is how many of them know about the origins of the group, but don't talk about it. This is a theme that goes back for a very long time. I know people who have left when they found out about the origins, about William Irvine and, his band of merry men. And when they went to talk to a worker about it, the workers shut them down and told them not to talk about it. Sometimes the workers deny that this ever happened. Other times the workers just tell them, yeah, we know this happened, but don't talk about it. We're not here for that. We're here to just, not talk about it. Just don't talk about it. Pretend this never happened. A lot of times people don't leave because they find out about the true origins of the group. They leave because when they ask about it, they get denied. They leave because the workers change the subject, don't want to talk about it, are dishonest about it. The dishonesty is the fascinating part to me. I know for a fact that many, many workers know about William Irvine. In fact, most, if not all of the older brothers especially, know about William Irvine. They'll give you a line like, well, God raised up certain people to continue his way or whatever. And then they'll blow off William Irvine as just some random dude who did this as well. But they'll never go any farther than that. And people aren't dumb. People read. People don't just read. They see pictures. They see photographs of all the workers that they grew up hearing about standing next to William Irvine. I'm not going to talk about the history a ton, but everything I've learned about the history, I've learned since I left. Let's just say that. I made a point of not learning about the history when I was leaving because I didn't want that to be the reason I left. I don't know why. It's just a point of pride, I guess, but I didn't want to add that to my plate of things I was dealing with as I left. So since I left, I've looked into it a little bit more, and it's been pretty fascinating. It's fascinating to see things like some people know exactly where the first Sunday morning meeting was. People know who all the initial workers were. People know who the first person who professed is. And I'll get into this some other time, but the first person that we know for sure professed was related directly to the overseer of my area growing up. The degrees of separation between me and William Irvine himself is 3. A lot of people grew up knowing the original workers, not just the original workers in the United States, like I was raised to believe. The original workers, period. And the older workers now know that. In fact, I have it on fairly good authority that one of the overseers actually wishes we could talk more openly about this, but knows that we can't and knows that a lot of people would leave if he did. So he's chosen not to, and that's really disappointing to me. I think he'd be surprised that some people actually do like honesty. It's disappointing to me when I find out that workers know more than they say, especially when at the Friends level, at the level of us townspeople, we were told that it didn't exist. We were told that William Irvine either didn't exist or didn't matter. When the book The Secret Sect came out, people in my hometown burned copies of it, burned them in fire stoves, lit the books on fire. Never in the history of humanity has the side burning the books been the right side. But that's what they did. And these are good, honest people. They're not people I look down on at all. They're friends of mine. But they were so bothered that somebody would make up this history that they burned copies of this book. Now that book's out of print now and it's gone. There's more recent books that are much better. And there's just more content nowadays because people know and can research and learn. People can find those pictures of the workers sitting next to each other, and then they can find the other picture that's the full picture that William Irvine hasn't been trimmed out of. I grew up listening to workers talk about Jack Carroll and I don't know, George Walker. Not really so much George Walker. Each part of the globe has their worker that they look up to. For us, it was Jack Carroll. For the east coast of the U.S., it was George Walker, I think. In Australia, there was Edward Cooney. We heard about him, but we heard that he was bad for obvious reasons because he ended up splitting off, I guess, or whatever. We knew all those names. We knew all the names of those workers, but we didn't know William Irvine. Even though they were all the same age, they all knew each other. They all knew the same people. And the overseers, when I was little, was the next generation. It was only 1 or 2 people removed from the person who founded the whole concept himself. I've learned all that since, and I'll talk about history another time, like I say, but the frustrating thing about it is learning not only that the history is well documented, but that workers know it themselves. There are people in my X group right now who learned about the history and were troubled by it and went to their workers to talk about it and ended up leaving meetings not because of the history, but because the workers were dishonest about it or told them to be dishonest. I know someone who went to an overseer and that overseer said, yes, that's true, but we're not going to talk about it. It's really funny nowadays that since the whole CSA debacle has been going on, I've actually heard workers mention something to the effect of, we've been doing it this way for 120 years or whatever. There's this implicit moving of the goalpost where some people are starting to accept it now. Now, again, I listened to conventions and heard a lot of workers denying it from the platform too, or saying it didn't matter and God raises up people and blah, 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 blah. But there's a much broader awareness of the history of the group now. And I really feel like if they would just be honest about it, it would have less of an effect. People would just be like, oh, well, that's nice. That somebody decided to do it this way and we're all going to do it this way and we feel good about it. That's good. It's never the crime, it's the cover up. And the thing I've learned since leaving is not only has it been covered up, it's being covered up. And that's really frustrating. Nothing is going to change while this type of thinking is predominant. The differences don't get worked out because nobody talks. There's no communication. There's really no fellowship around even the theology, even the beliefs of the group. We call it fellowship and we hang out together and have potlucks, but it's not really fellowship because we're not partaking in anything together. The message is simplified down so that everyone can kind of agree on the basic precepts of it and not get involved any further. Because if they did, they'd realize there's a lot of differences. There's another weird thing I learned about the workers, and it matches something that I've noticed, but I hadn't quite put a name to. And that is that workers don't really go out to spread the gospel. It's not a thing they do. It's a thing they talk about. It's a thing they have verses for. We even have hymns that talk about the workers going out to the harvest field and finding needy souls and, the harvest field that's ready for harvest or whatever. But workers don't really go out looking for new people. In fact, when we were in meetings, I think it was the last year we were in meetings, one of the workers sent an email out to the field and told us that it was actually our job to do that. That the people in the meetings needed to be bringing their friends from school and their coworkers and stuff so that the workers could preach to them. Just a full-on admission that the workers weren't doing it themselves. I don't know what the workers think they're doing. I know that a lot of the workers that have left have mentioned that. The workers I know that have left, I should say. This is a major factor in them leaving, is the realization that they weren't spreading the gospel like they thought they were. They thought that was what they were giving up their life to do. They gave up their lives to do it. They gave up everything. They gave up every ambition they had to go spread the gospel. And when it actually came time to spread the gospel, they didn't do any of that. There was an ex-worker once who told me a story about finding a very effective way to reach people. And I'm not going to go into what that way was because it would probably give away who the person was. And they told me this in confidence. So I'll just outline roughly what it was, which is they found a way to invite a lot of people to meetings. A very simple way. It wasn't like going out on social media and creating a following. It wasn't some crazy worldly thing. It was just an effective way to reach people. And it worked really well. This ex-worker told me that they employed this way of reaching people and talking to people and communicating with people. And it worked really well. They had, I believe, 11 outsiders, quote unquote, show up at their first gospel meeting after they employed this method. And the overseer found out about the method and shut it down. I asked why that was. Why would the overseer not want them to bring more people to meeting? And this ex-worker wasn't really sure, other than we just tried something new. We tried something different. We actually tried something at all. They were in an area that there was some interest in, so they reached out to those people. And the overseer didn't like the method that they were doing it, didn't understand it maybe, thought that, well, who knows what they thought. It doesn't really matter. This ex-worker told me that the overseer later put out a letter telling the workers that they didn't need to reach out so much, that they didn't need to go looking for new people so much, that they had a big flock already, and it's their job to just tend to the sheep. I believe that was the phrase they used in the letter. Just tend to the sheep that we already have. That's our job now. That's what we need to do. I was incredulous when I heard this. This blew my mind because, of course, we learned that people give up their lives to go become workers and reach out and go find everyone they can, spread the gospel as far and wide as they can to every country, right? We hear about it going to every country, reaching as many people as possible so we can save their souls. And then I hear that an overseer is telling the workers that it doesn't really matter that much, that don't worry about it so much, just tend to the flock you have. I didn't even believe this, and the person who told me this is a very trustworthy, intelligent person that I trust a lot. A few months after this person told me this story, I saw the letter, and sure enough, that's exactly what it said. It said, don't worry so much about it, stop trying to spread the gospel all these ways, just take care of the flock you have. I don't know why this overseer felt this way. I can only imagine, and I could speculate all day, but At the end of the day, it was part of why this worker ended up leaving. The realization that they'd given up their lives, but for nothing. This worker also told me something that almost all of the other ex-workers I've talked to have told me, which is they preached a little bit, they went house to house, they had long dinners where they talked about extended genealogies. The most prideful thing that 2x2s allow themselves to do is talk about who among their relatives were professing. And this worker called it endless genealogies, which is something the Bible warns against, which is hilarious. But then in the spare time that they thought they should be spreading the gospel, this worker told me that they got shipped to the convention grounds to do projects and build things around the convention grounds to make them more convention-y. And, we don't have church buildings, but we treat convention grounds like they are. This worker actually left the ministry and sent a letter to the overseer to this effect that this person said, I wanted to preach the gospel and we're not preaching the gospel, and I don't believe this is what I was called to do. And this worker left the ministry right as their companions and those around them were getting called to the convention grounds to go work on the convention stuff. I'll talk about conventions a little more because conventions are pretty fascinating too. The workers also live weirder lives than I gave them credit for. It's already a little weird from a natural level to give up all you have and go house to house and live out of a suitcase or two. It's even weirder when that's not actually what's happening. It's happening to a lot of people. It's happening for a lot of people. It's happening for a lot of the workers, but not all. Some of the workers have quite a bit of stuff. I've heard a handful of stories of workers just storing large amounts of stuff at people's houses. And in one case, when the CSA thing happened and one of the workers was being really indignant about it and pretending it wasn't real and, talking badly about all the people who were coming forward, the home where this worker's stuff was being stored, the man of that house went to the worker and said, hey, come get your stuff. I have a lot of your stuff. You're not living out of a suitcase. You're living out of my garage. Come get it and take it someplace. I don't know what happened with that story. I don't know if this worker ever came and got their stuff or whatever happened to it, but I thought that was kind of funny. There's one-off stories of really giant purchases, but I'm not going to say any of those because I don't want to tip off who I'm talking about, but I believe them. The other thing is that it seems like it's just the brothers who have stuff and who have money. The sisters don't have any of this stuff. One thing that I hear over and over and over from both ex-brother and ex-sister workers is that the brothers have money and the brothers have stuff and the sisters don't. The sisters tend to kick up all their money to somebody else. The brothers tend to collect it and carry around much larger sums. I've actually heard the numbers from several people, and it changes place to place, but ex-workers have talked about how at conventions they get handed wads of money, small wads for the sisters and much larger wads for the brothers, and the brothers seem to just have everything they need all the time and the sisters don't. I've heard several stories of sister workers needing extra support from their family back home just for day-to-day stuff. And I've never heard that from the brothers. I don't really have anything to say about that, really. I just think it's interesting. It's something I never really knew. I get questions all the time. Every time I go on a podcast, every time I talk to anybody new, they ask me how money works in the 2x2s. And I don't have a clue. I think that's weird because since I've left, I've heard dollar amounts that would blow my mind, would blow anybody's mind if they actually knew them. And some people seem to think that it's common knowledge. It's definitely not. I don't know these numbers, and I'm not going to say any of the numbers because I can't validate them, but they're very large numbers. The amount of money that just moves around hand to hand is really amazing, and it's more than probably needs to be used day to day. But that's just my estimation. It's a bummer, too, because the workers who I've heard talk about not having enough are not the types who would have, well, if they were still in the work, would have brought it up or asked for it. They all understand on some level when they go into the ministry that they're making a sacrifice. They're sacrificing the things that they need and want in life. So when they don't have what they need or want, at least what they want, hopefully they have what they need. Not always, though. They don't always have that. But they tend to do well with what they have. The ones who are just honest and trying to live that life never complain about it. It's when they leave that they really start talking about how frustrating it is to not have what they need when they need it. Not really going to get into details, but if you know these workers, I hope that you can take care of them, but just on a personal level. I wouldn't give any money higher up than just the ones in my area. And I never did, and I'm glad I didn't, and I never will. The overseers have all the money they can handle, and significantly more. And there have been some court cases where that's been found out. Just look at the Alberta excommunication to find out how many millions of dollars are being stored up there. If I had to guess, I would say millions of dollars are being stored in every state, but I don't know that for sure. So that's just my opinion. One constant thing I hear about the workers' lives that's interesting is just how abusive it is to be a worker. How the power structure just facilitates so much emotional and spiritual abuse. I've never heard of physical abuse. I imagine that happens. I hope it doesn't. But just the verbal, emotional, spiritual abuse that happens among the workers. Every single ex-worker that I've ever talked to, and I've talked to double digits, I've talked to a lot. Every single one has mentioned this, has mentioned how they got harangued by older workers when they were young, how depressed they got, trying to live a humble life, trying to spread the gospel. And instead they're going to these long dinners, sitting around at tea, not doing anything like they thought they had agreed to, and then getting emotionally abused by other workers. Like I say, every single one, without exception, has mentioned that. Every one. You know, you grow up believing that the workers are the humblest people on the planet, and they're kind and good people, good-natured, and they're who we hope to be like. You know, we model ourselves after them to some degree. We look up to them. We worship them. Let's just be completely honest about this. We worship the workers as 2x2s. That is a thing. I'll die on that hill. But then you find out that they're human, and you realize that maybe humans shouldn't be in that situation. Maybe that's not a great situation for humans. Anyway, that's just my judgment on it. What bothers me about this emotional abuse is that it is systemic abuse. It's not something you can just blow off as, well, this worker's grumpy. We all knew that grumpy worker growing up. The older workers are grumpier than the younger workers, and that's understandable too. I always thought the overseers were the grumpiest of all. That totally makes sense now. But when it's all of them, it's a system. It can't just be chalked up to individuals anymore. It's a systemic thing. Abuse is systemic when you can't escape the abuse. If you can't walk away from the abuse is systemic for you. It means you live in an abusive system. You can try to play it off as, you know, a bad apple here or there, but if you can't actually escape it, then it's not good for you. And I know that people will say, oh, well, then you should just leave the ministry. That's not easy to do. It's extremely difficult. When you've given up everything in life, just walking away from the ministry is extremely difficult. And I've outlined it other places, and I'm not going to get into it again, but I'll just leave it said that if you're stuck in a system and the system is abusive to you, it's an abusive system. I don't care how you look at it. It's not a good system. And I can't imagine my own children growing up and going into a system like that. It sounds terrible. Another thing about workers that's fascinating is how human they are. It seems like this shouldn't be surprising. I feel ashamed that I got into adulthood thinking that the workers had some sort of special dispensation to live superhuman lives, because they clearly don't. Every worker I know who's left has talked about how human the workers are, and every experience I've had since we left shows that the ones who are still in are very human too. Usually I find this out because they've been human in bad ways. I have heard rumors and rumors and rumors of affairs between the ministers and the friends in their areas, affairs between each other. And the thing that's fascinating about it is that some of the ones that I've heard have had multiple affairs, and I've heard it from multiple people, are also the ones that chastise and threatened excommunication to the friends in their areas for the same thing. Workers who go around with the keys to heaven and hell, as far as we're concerned, living really hypocritical lives, telling the friends that you have to live a certain way, telling them you have to dress a certain way, chastising them for absolutely everything, breaking the antennas off their cars so they don't listen to the radio, chastising people for having TVs, forbidding people for having TVs, forbidding people for every single little thing. I don't want to go through every single story again, but things like coming over to have a visit because they see a woman wearing pants, or telling a woman they can't be baptized because she cut bangs or whatever. Having control over every single part of a person's life and then living a hypocritical life is really fascinating to me. It's interesting. It's a very human thing. I mean, we're all hypocrites on some level, I'm sure. But when you threaten people with the keys to hell and you preach to people in gospel meetings so that children are listening to all the ways that they're going to get sent to hell because they are normal, you threaten people, you preach fire and brimstone at people, and you have generations of people who hear these things from the moment they're born, practically. Every single meeting they hear about all the ways that they're going to, their human nature is going to run them into hell. And every decision they make is bad, and every thought in their heart is evil continually, and all this stuff, on and on and on. And then to find out that those same workers have had double-digit affairs, some of them. And those are, by the way, those are the ones that have admitted it. I've heard rumors too. I'll just talk about the ones who've admitted it. There's workers out there, some of who are in the work still, some of who have left, who have admitted to tons of affairs. Mind you, clergy layperson relationships are actually illegal in some states. I've looked up the laws on some of this stuff. If it were an established church, it would be illegal for them to do what they're doing. Not being a church is letting them get away with immoral behavior. So let's just be really clear on the higher moral law here. But threatening people all the time, having people essentially live in fear of themselves, and definitely in fear of the workers, while the workers are just doing whatever, hypocrisy doesn't really cover it. Hypocrisy is not a thorough enough word for this. The shameful behavior to not only live a hypocritical life, but also to have people living in terror of your teachings and scared of their own shadows and scared of your judgment and scared of God's judgment, scared of eternity because of you. When you can't keep it together yourself, hypocrisy doesn't even cover that. It's not a good enough word. There's got to be a stronger word. I don't know what that word is, but it's got to be a stronger word. It's really upsetting. And like I say, a lot of this stuff I find out later. And it's not just people coming to me talking about workers. It's ex-workers coming to me telling me about how they lived, their companions' lives. It bums me out because I got into adulthood believing that the workers had some sort of special dispensation from God to live superhuman lives. Because they kind of told me they did. Because it was part of the system. It's part of God's one true way that would be true. It has to be true for the rest of the system to hold up. And it doesn't hold up. And now add on the amplifying factor of the post-Deangate CSA revelations. Finding out that it's not just affairs. It's not just consensual relationships. It's much, much worse stuff. The FBI is involved now. National media has caught on and has started writing articles about it. It's crazy, crazy stuff. And the fact that anybody is still believing this stuff, believing in the one true way nonsense, believing in the exclusivity of it, is just befuddling to me. I don't know what to do about it. And I'm not going to do anything. I don't ever want to pull somebody away from meetings. That's not something I want to do. But I think people need to talk more honestly among themselves about it. Another thing that's been a revelation to me since leaving is how conventions operate. Here's my impression of conventions while I was in. I believed that probably a long time ago, some land was bought by somebody well-to-do probably, and they either handed it down over time or sold it to professing people, and they had a convention and everything was fine. And I think that there's a way you could spin this that's true. But the details of it are a little weirder. I have become privy to the experiences of a lot of convention ground owners since starting my X group. Some have spoken directly to us, some have spoken through other people to us, and it's really, really troubling. Their experiences, I would say, are actually pretty dark in some cases. Not all cases. I'm going to preface this ahead of time with not all conventions. The stories I told about the workers were nearly universal, all of them. These ones are not universal. Some conventions are just owned by somebody and they have them and that's fine. They're independently wealthy and it's not a big deal. A lot of convention grounds are not run this way. Here's a scenario that happens too often. A convention grounds owner is getting older, wants to leave their property, wants to sell it or whatever. And so they decide to get it ready to sell. The workers then step in and act almost as real estate agents for it. I've heard of several cases where convention grounds were sold below market value, even though they had offers at market value by family members or people that knew them or something like that. Something fascinating about convention grounds is that the workers truly believe that they essentially own the convention grounds. That regardless of the money, regardless of what money is changing hands or what title, who owns property or whatever, the workers tend to believe that they own it. And when I say the workers, I mean overseers and a few brothers at the top. Each of the overseers has a few bros around them that help them make decisions, and they act as a group a lot of times. And my impression is that they tend to think they own all the convention grounds. And I don't say that flippantly. I think they really do think that. The demands that workers put on convention grounds owners are shocking. It's really weird. It's a very strange thing. They don't treat the properties as if they're private property. Now, if it's God's one true way that doesn't have any buildings or anything. It seems like having private property in the hands of private owners isn't that big of a deal, but the workers don't treat it that way. The workers oftentimes step in to facilitate sales, to convince the grounds owners to sell at certain times, to sell to certain people. I recently heard of one that was sold well under market value, even though they had offers above market value from family members of the owner, because the workers wanted the property to stay in certain hands. Bit of a conflict of interest in my mind, but again, if that's what the seller wants, then, who am I to say? It's a private sale. Again, there's no record keeping of any of this stuff, so it's just private people with private property. That's what it looks like anyway. That's what it looks like on paper. I've always thought it was a little strange that when rich people buy property, middle class and maybe even lower middle class people, maybe even lower class people come and they come around, convention times, at preps times or whatever, and put a lot of their own sweat equity into the property, including building new buildings and things. I've always thought that's a little strange because it's like, so you have people who could never afford that property building up this property and adding wealth to somebody who was already rich. I just always thought that was a little strange. And I still think that, but as I've gotten to learn, it's not always that simple. It's not just rich people with property that other people are adding value to. Sometimes that is the case, and that's a little weird, but sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes it's people who have the wealth to get into a property like that, who can afford it, or maybe just afford it, or maybe barely afford it. This scenario that I'm going to outline right now has happened many times. And if you know me and know what convention grounds I know about, go ahead and guess, because you're not going to guess. It's not obvious from the outside which convention grounds this is the case for. I know of some convention grounds that are owned privately and it's not that big of a deal. And it's owned by somebody who can absolutely afford it and it's not that big of a deal. There's many other convention grounds that this isn't the case for, that the person who owns it can actually afford it, but the workers convince them to do it anyway, with the promise that they'll give them money from the money given to them to supplement the property, to help pay for property taxes, to help pay for expenses of owning such a giant property, to help pay for upkeep of the buildings and utility expenses year round, not just at convention time. I was always sure that at convention time expenses would skyrocket, but then, people donate stuff and donate food, donate money, donate whatever to help offset that spike in financial requirement. And I think that is true. But I've had some convention ground owners outline to me, or those around me, how they got into owning convention grounds with the promise that the workers would supplement the money. If everybody's on the same page and going in faith here, that tends to work. But as soon as something comes up like the CSA thing, or like any sort of abuse, if the church decides not to acknowledge it, as they have, they've formally decided not to, that puts the convention grounds owners in a bind, because now their wealth is tied up in something they can't necessarily afford, but the means to pay for it is tied up by people that aren't acting morally. And they now are stuck in a position where they have to either choose their own financial health or to act morally and ethically by their own standards. When you realize the church isn't living up to the moral and ethical standards you have, but you're tied to them financially, you're really stuck. This has happened several times. Or say something like this happens, where the workers convince somebody to buy a convention grounds and then start demanding upgrades to those grounds. And not minor upgrades either. Not, we need to get the kitchen up to a health code or something, but demands like, we need a larger building for the meetings. We need larger dorms. We'd like an add-on to this building. When the workers start making demands like that and they have the money that you need to pay for your basic living expenses, all of a sudden there's a huge conflict of interest there. It's very ugly, I think. It's immoral, clearly. I've heard of multiple people having to sell just because they couldn't afford the deal that the workers convinced them to get into in the first place. They either had to bend to demands from workers and overseers that they didn't want to do, that they didn't feel right doing, that they didn't feel moral about, they didn't feel ethical about, or lose the property. Some of the stories I hear make a real obvious point of the person owning the grounds thinking, hey, it's just a farm. We can just have conventions. Why do we need to throw tons and tons and tons of money, meaning 5-6 figures, into buildings? We don't have church buildings, right? We just have some private buildings that we can all use. Why do we need to keep upgrading them? People making jokes about, hey, where do we put the stained glass? That type of thing. I've heard that type of phrasing several times. I've heard of several convention grounds where the people, for ethical reasons, moral reasons, or even just belief reasons, have been run into their own financial ruin trying to run a convention grounds. And you'll never hear from these people because almost every time these people are true believing people. They're not people trying to bring down the convention. In fact, when they leave, they're still true believing. They just feel like it just doesn't work for them. And, they hope that the next person who owns it can have the faith to make it work out. These people are taken advantage of by unscrupulous workers to their own financial ruin, blow through their retirement in the twilight years of their lives. So they end up living out of a trailer or a small house somewhere, or living on property somebody else owns, after they'd been living on a giant farm. When I think of it now, it's like, man, the rich person owning property and letting other people build up their value and build up equity for them actually sounds like a preferable scenario, to be completely honest. And, in some cases that is the case. In many cases that is the case. And there's no way you can tell looking from the outside which is which. I would have been completely wrong. If you'd have asked me to guess which scenarios went with which grounds, I would have been wrong. But you learn something every day, especially when you run an X group. Since leaving, I've learned a lot more about the traditions of the 2x2s. Traditions/rules. It's hard to just have traditions when you're the one true perfect way, you're the only way to heaven, etc., etc. When you're the true and living only one single way, you can't really have traditions. Everything's a rule, Anything left up to interpretation is a problem if you can't get anything wrong and you're a works-based belief system. So these are all rules, but I've been fascinated to learn about the differences in different areas. Now, some of them are obvious. When I grew up in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, so I knew about things like divorce and remarriage being different on the West Coast as it is on the East Coast, and both sides believing very strongly that they had the right version. I also learned about weird things like different countries not allowing radios, even though we allowed radios. Radios were never a big deal to us. But since I left, I learned that a lot of the traditions have changed a lot. The radios is an interesting one. I have connections in the Southern Hemisphere, and the workers down there have always hated radios, to the point that they would go around and snap the antennas off of cars of professing people. You're the one true way. You can't let small things like destruction of private property get in the way of salvation, So I grew up listening to the radio and thinking it wasn't that big of a deal. I listened to music a lot, and I listened to all kinds of sports and politics and all kinds of stuff. I learned since leaving that the radio thing was actually a thing here too, in the United States. Someone recently told me that even down in Oregon and Northern California, workers were breaking antennas off of cars not that long ago. I didn't know that had happened. It's kind of interesting how these things change over time. I've learned more about the black stockings. That was a real thing for a while, how women had to wear black stockings. I won't touch on a lot more of these, but the ones that I've learned now are fascinating to me. I learned about Christmas. Christmas is a weird thing up in the Northwest of the United States. Some people celebrated it, some people didn't. Several times I remember when I was younger having friends' parents ask me very sneakily and quietly how my family treated Christmas, because no one really knew how to do it, but no one wanted to do it wrong. You can't have a tradition, you got to have it right. The general tradition where I was from is that Christmas was bad, that we didn't celebrate it. People had different versions of acceptance of, listening to Christmas music, but maybe not caroling, or enjoying Christmas lights, enjoying Christmas light displays, but never putting any up in your house. No one ever had a Christmas tree. That was not allowed. Christmas presents were kind of a weird thing. Everyone had some version of it. Everyone tried to kind of fake it or tried to approximate it in some way. It was a lot of effort to avoid nothing. I don't really know what we were avoiding. I guess we were just avoiding being worldly, whatever that means. It made for a very strange upbringing for a lot of people. And what I think is crazy is that I found out after leaving what a recent innovation that was. In fact, I can pinpoint which worker in which time period decided that Christmas was bad and no one should celebrate it. It blew me away. It was not that long before I was born. It's very strange to think of something as essentially gospel growing up, that everyone around you, family, friends, and everyone in your fields and your workers and everybody had certain ways of celebrating or not celebrating, and you had to do it this way. When a few years before me, things completely changed. In fact, I'm not even positive it was before I was born. It might have been after, but we'll stick with that time period. The doctrine, the gospel, as spoken by the words of the workers, straight from God, changed drastically several times. One of those changes was holidays and how to celebrate them and how not to. And there's long sermons printed up online by workers decrying how the world celebrates the birth of Jesus. So a major change happened. Each generation had their own version of the absolute truth. And I think that's really weird. It's weird to say out loud. It's weird to think that traditions can change so much, but yet be believed as if they were true, not good, but true, by the people doing it. I think that might be why there's so much hesitancy around the history of the group, because you don't even have to go back very far to see how quickly things change. People's dress have changed, traditions have changed around holidays, even workers' opinions about marriage have changed. Very few parts of the belief system haven't changed over time. Even the workers' belief that what they're doing is preaching a unique version of the gospel has changed. That wasn't original. I'll talk about that later in a history podcast maybe, but it's just interesting to hear about all those changes. And there's a bunch more. I'm not going to go into a bunch of them, but they're interesting. They're interesting to learn about. And now I have a support group with thousands of people in it, and exchanging stories and listening to those stories are just fascinating. Someone recently asked if anyone was upset that they weren't allowed to go to college. And then other people were like, what are you talking about? We went to college. I didn't have a problem. My parents were educators. My parents went to college. My parents were professionals. But then other parts of the country absolutely forbid it. Workers were very down on people who went to college, especially women. Different traditions about celebrations like birthdays or weddings or things like that. Completely different. I knew some of those existed, but I didn't know how hardcore they were. And I also didn't know how often they had changed. How workers would one year say, well, women are allowed this type of wedding dress. And a few years later, well, okay, actually, this is fine. And no one ever challenges it because it's the word of God. No one ever challenges it because the worker's word is rarely challenged. And no one ever talks about it. I've learned a lot more since leaving, and especially since starting a support group. And especially since the CSA catastrophe has engulfed the friends and workers. I've learned a lot through that. I've learned a lot about how the workers operate. I've learned some weird things about money that I don't really feel comfortable talking about yet because it just seems like my information's too incomplete. My opinions have even changed quite a bit. When I left meetings, I would have been fine taking my kids back to see it just for nostalgia. Maybe take them to a convention meeting sometime. Right now, I wouldn't go near the place. I've learned so much that I don't think I would ever go back. Not go back to meetings. I wasn't planning on that, but I wouldn't go near one. I think they're a problem. I've learned a lot of stories from people. I've learned a lot of trauma. I've learned a lot of sadness and grief. And I'm not going to talk about that all here. This isn't the place for that, but maybe I'll talk about it another time. I'll talk about history another time. I'll talk about a lot of stuff another time. Do I know more than the people inside? I don't know, but I know more than me when I was inside. That's about it.